Hey everybody, welcome to week 14. It's the last week of new content, so congratulations, you made it. You've learned all of the stuff about our government. Now you know how to be president and all of the positions, a senator, whatever it is, you're trained. We're good, we're ready to go. Of course, let's learn about our foreign policy first. All right, so I forgot to put a learning objective slide. So learning objectives for the week, we're going to learn some key concepts, a couple theories about our foreign policy in the United States. We're also going to dive into some concepts that when you go further on in political science studies, and you will explore, especially looking at some entities on the international arena, some agreements of the past that have been heavily discussed in recent years. Just some general overview. The main objective is to understand just war theory and remember a couple key terms. So let's get going. So just war theory. What is just war theory? Well, at large, before we dive into the definition, this is a theory, a concept utilized to understand whether involvement in an international conflict is morally right. Is it just for the state to engage to risk the lives of their citizens for this conflict? Well, when answering this question, it kind of comes in two sets. You have jus ad bellum and jus ad bello, just in bello. And I will mispronounce those a million times over, and I will never ask you to remember the Latin definitions. So jus ad bellum, the first dimension of just war theory, presents a set of conditions under which a resort to war is morally legitimate. So think about the early onset setting in which war is acceptable to engage with. And then jus in bello identifies conditions in which soldiers and states can conduct themselves during war, the treatment of prisoners of war and various dimensions of that portion of war. Now, when we consider jus ad bellum, the main question asked is, are the damages that we are going to incur by going into this conflict, by engaging in war, are they proportional to the possible damages that would occur if we did not go to war at all? Basically saying, if the nation did nothing, are the citizens of the United States at risk? If they are at risk, then it warrants the nation getting involved, the state getting involved, and engaging in the conflict and possibly putting citizens of other nations or those fighting for other nations at risk. So think of it another way. World War II, dropping of the nuclear bomb. This is one where there's open discussion and debate about this. We had a sentiment at the time that, well, the Japanese military was relentless. They were not giving up, and they were going to continue fighting for many more years. And we could have dropped the nuclear bombs, and which we did, which pretty much ended the conflict. Now, were the damages that would have happened if we did not drop those nuclear bombs proportional to the damages that occurred when we dropped them? That's the moral question that asks if an action in war is just and legitimate. Now, another dimension of this, I teach this one because I look back when I took one of my first American government courses, and I had a professor. I remember he taught at he studied at Harvard. He came to teach at my school in Virginia at the time, and every single day he came in with the thickest of sunglasses, looking just rough every day. Would come off, take them off, and then just start talking. And one of the last lectures he gave that was captivating to me was about preemptive and preventive self-defense. And basically said, when you are in charge of a military, if you as an individual had to make this decision, which approach would you take when engaging in conflicts? Would you emphasize preemptive self-defense and act preemptively when you believe adversaries are about to attack? Think of it simply as, a great moment in history, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Imagine if something did happen. What was the justification for something happening at that time? Well, both sides thought there was imminent action about to occur. There was a period where we thought they were about to send missiles. There was an attack that was about to happen. Well, a preemptive self-defense strategy would entail acting immediately in that condition. The second you know that, or you feel that an assault is inevitable, that's the primary framing I would use for preemptive self-defense. In contrast, you have preventative self-defense. This is when you think of you see a state, you believe they will eventually become a potential adversary. I think a great example in contemporary international conflicts would be Russia. Russia currently is not a threat to the United States when it comes to military conflict. They are currently in a conflict with Ukraine. Some that are pro, certain sentiment, certain engagement in that conflict would argue that it is best to take a preventive self-defense approach because it is, in their eyes, likely that the next adversary would be possibly us or another one of our allies. So preemptive self-defense, it's when oversimplifying this. I don't want these definitions or descriptions given to me in a quiz, but I like to oversimplify things and then build up. Preemptive, it's waiting a little longer than preventive. Simply put, it's not an acceptable answer for a quiz, but a rule of thumb. And so those are the two dimensions of self-defense. And then to bounce back, just war theory is the concept that we utilize to understand if engagement in an international conflict by the state is justified. And we do that by asking what conditions warrant our engagement in this conflict, and when we do engage, are we acting morally? So when we talk about just war theory, international conflict at large, we have to understand that we don't just use military strength as our form of influence. There are definitely forms of hard and soft power. And this is a very important distinction to be able to make when you continue on. Now let's think about hard power. Well, hard power would be the response you would likely give in a preemptive or preventative attack, self-defense attack. Think of hard power as coercing another nation through official military or economic means. Another great example of a hard power would be, in certain circumstances, a tariff or various economic pressures you can put on place on certain nations. You could restrict their trade. You could restrict their trade with just your nation domestically. And those are hard power incentives to have another nation act accordingly as we desire. In addition to sending troops, providing aid to other military collectives within the region. Think of some real world examples: economic sanctions on Russia post the Ukrainian conflict. You could also include that to entail some of the tariffs that are currently happening. The tariffs on China would be a good example of a hard power. We also see economic sanctions on North Korea that have been happening for multiple presidencies and still are in place today, which has resulted in a heavy reliance of North Korea on China's trade, but not as easy access to global trade as they would likely hope. We also see another example, if you go back in time a little bit, troop deployments in Afghanistan. It's probably getting a little outdated, probably time to start including a different reference for that. But we also see that hard power is not the only way to engage and apply pressures to other international agencies, other states and nations. We can also engage in soft power. And realistically, the United States is one of the best nations when it comes to soft power because of the influence that American culture has globally. This is, so understanding this, soft power is encouraging other nations through culture and diplomacy. You could think of diplomatic efforts and treaty formations. We're going to cover an old treaty that is no longer in effect. That is a good example of soft power that does include trade. We also see that a great and easy example of understanding soft power is thinking about America's culture and corporations. McDonald's, Nike, our music. Think about how popular the Taylor Swift. Yeah, Taylor Swift is in Europe and China. We have a million examples of individuals like that. Drake all over the world. Now Kendrick, I think he won that one out. I don't know if he's as globally famous though. That's a question. But also think about Nike, McDonald's. Think about how you could travel anywhere in the world and likely you'll find a McDonald's somewhere or some Americanized restaurants. And that is a great example of soft power. We, through our culture, are influencing them to have positive thoughts when they engage with American corporations or institutions, hopefully positive, sometimes not always guaranteed. But this is one way in which we can encourage positive relations with us and other nations. And additionally, treaty formation, which we'll go into in a second. But the main takeaway from this slide is to understand the distinction between hard power and soft power. Hard power is using the military or strong-handed economic means, while soft power is relying on culture and positive diplomacy. Whenever the United States engages in any international conflict, the aim is to always utilize soft power to the greatest extent, as this is a tool that the United States has at its hands, unlike any other nation globally. So we know some general theories about conflict: soft power, hard power, just war theory. Now let's talk about when we utilize that power and we do engage in conflict, who is the one making the decisions within our government? Well, we have to understand the balance between the Congress and the presidency during conflict. In recent years, in the last 100 years, we've really strengthened the power of the presidency in these times. We look back at and of course, this ebbs and flows. We've also limited the presidency's power. So the one dimension we remember from our executive branch lecture: what is one of the titles granted to the president? Head of the armed services. So we see that they do have a significant role in military decision making, especially during times of conflict. Now, we also look at the War Powers Act of 1973. This act, written and drafted and signed by Congress, remember the 4 steps that you must go through to pass legislation happened for the War Powers Act of 1973, in which this act limits the president's use of troops in military action without congressional approval. So, what are the specifics of this? We know that there is a 60-day grace period. The president, independently can deploy troops anywhere in the world for 60 days without any approval from another individual within our government, another individual within Congress. Now, if they do not get approval from Congress, mostly the Senate, within 60 days, then the president will have to retract and pull back, withdraw those troops. So we have that dimension. We also see that the president must notify Congress within 48 hours of deploying any U.S. armed forces into hostilities or situations where hostilities are imminent. So we see that this is a large reason why we do get news reports about presidents deploying troops oftentimes a day before it occurs, because this is in response to the president having to notify Congress and then eventually making it to the press. But we do see that due to the War Powers Act of 1973, we restricted the powers that were heavily granted to the presidency during times of conflict to allow for checks to be handed to Congress at large. So we see the one detail we want to remember from this slide, that 60 days Congress has to approve of the deployment of troops made by a president, or they will be withdrawn. And the founding constitutional legitimacy of this action is that Congress is granted the power of the purse. We do know that the biggest expense of our government is our military. We have the most built up military internationally. We compete, we stand out amongst the global arena significantly. And so we see that through the budget that we pay to our to our military. So what is another power granted to Congress? The power of the purse, the power to control our budget. So the Congress must have some influence on the amount of money we spend on troop deployments, for example. So that is one of the foundations of legitimacy that validated the War Powers Act of 1973, as the president can order certain military actions, but the action cannot be fully executed until Congress funds it within 60 days. So balance between Congress and the presidency. Significant amount of power is granted to the president. The president can make quick, immediate actions when the nation is in need. We cannot take extensive amounts of time to act. We remember the Articles of Confederation early in this course in early American history. One of the biggest flaws was a domestic conflict in which we were not able to mobilize troops quick enough. So concentrating that power into the hands of one individual is important for being able to have quick action. But we need to also maintain our constitutional structure of checks and balances and grant Congress the power to act as a check on that single-handed authority. So now that we know our general structure for what we have to do domestically, who's in charge, when it's just and right to engage, and what approaches we'll utilize through soft power before we really engage in military conflict, let's talk about what arena we're even talking about engaging with, the international arena. This is a random collection of entities that exist or agreements that exist on the national stage or existed in the past on the international stage that I think are important. If you continue on in political science at large, you will hear these terms a million times over. Now, I will not be asking you to answer questions about this slide on the final, but I do think it's important for you to at least listen for a minute and make sure you familiarize yourself with these concepts and terms. So, NAFTA. And a large reason of why I included them is because you'll hear about them a lot in contemporary discussions. So, for one example, NAFTA. This is the elimination of tariffs between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and was done historically to promote trade. And we do see in Donald Trump's first term as president, he abolished NAFTA, and we have not implemented it since. So this is one example of one of those agreements that you can create on the international arena, utilizing hard power tools through diplomacy. So this would be an example of soft power because you're restricting the use of hard power tools. So it's an example of diplomacy. So we do have this not in effect today, and it's just an example of an economic agreement that exists on the international arena in which there are many. We also see the NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is a military pact and was originally created to push back against the Soviet expansion during the Cold War. This includes US, Canada, Western Europe, and many post-Soviet nations. Think of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. I'm not exactly sure if they are included, but that region of the world of Central Asia. We also see, and this is primarily a military pact, a treaty, making sure that when an ally is under threat, we will defend them, or at least supply aid in which to help them defend themselves. We also see the United Nations. This is a collective of states aimed at maintaining international peace. They do not have a military arm. They do not have an enforcement arm, but they do represent 193 nations. I think there are just a little over 200 nations globally, so pretty much every nation on the planet is represented in the United Nations. We have the Security Council, which with the leading nations of the globe, the U.S., Iran, China, Russia. We have with veto powers within this agency. But what the United Nations is structured to do is provide declarations in which the global governance, although there's no enforcement mechanism or currency or really true uniting characteristics other than the United Nations, they're able to provide declarations and suggestions for other nations. One of their first actions is relating to a conflict that is still ongoing today, back in 1945, and when they were formed after the end of the conflict of World War II. We do see one of their earliest actions in the early 50s was to propose a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine. We do see today that there is a conflict that is persisting, especially in the Gaza Strip region and West Bank of Israel and Palestine. So we see they provide solutions, although they do not require that they be accepted. Although that is true and did not work in the 1950s regarding Israel-Palestine, we do see the United Nations having great success throughout history after their implementation. We also see, and that's a peacekeeping collective. We also see a more economic-based collective in the European Union. They're an economic and political alliance between European states, and think of it as they have a common currency. Instead of it being the United States currency and the peso down in Mexico, and then what is it even called in Canada? I don't even know what their coins are called. The currency in Canada. Instead, it's basically agreeing that we will all use the same currency for easier commerce, easier trade between nations. We will have free trade, so it's a lot like NAFTA, but with Europe exclusively. They will have common tariffs with other nations, and it's primarily economic, but it strengthens the states and creates more unification and ability to move and have easier mobility between states in that region of the world. We also see non-governmental organizations. These are organizations that are not connected to any state governments, and they do not have structures within them that are aiming to obtain profit. So they're non-profit organizations that promote peace with global ramifications. So think of it as there are many nonprofits that will go into a great example. The current war-torn areas, think of the Gaza Strip, and they will aim not to fight the conflict, but to provide resources to those in need, to provide food to the citizens of the region. And we have non-governmental organizations operating globally, even domestically, at all times. So one of the final things I want to cover in foreign policy in the United States is one of the more entertaining ones, nuclear war, and a concept that comes with nuclear war called mutually assured destruction. Well, what is mutually assured destruction? Well, it's the reality that there are multiple nations with nuclear arms accessible. And the reason we haven't seen, well, we've used the nuclear weapons, but the reason no other nation has used nuclear weapons since the first bombs were dropped when the US was the only nation with nuclear weapons, now that multiple nations have them, a concept of mutually assured destruction has originated, in which we understand that if a nation utilized their nuclear weapons, the other nation they are utilizing their nuclear weapons on will likely have just enough time to know that it's happening and will then launch their nuclear weapons at the nation launching them at first. And what would happen? Well, there would be mutually assured destruction of both nations. And that is the reason why, theoretically, we have not had nuclear conflicts or any nuclear bombs dropped since the expansion of access of these weapons. Now, we also have to remember that, well, to backtrack a bit, when we look at the contemporary threats of nuclear war, we see that many nations have nuclear weapons, expanding with every year, although there are global agreements. Hey Mo, my cat's attacking my wall right now for some reason. Although there are global agreements limiting the building of these nuclear armaments. We also see that when we think about nuclear weapon and nuclear conflict, no conflict portrays this better than the Cold War. Remember the Cold War as the Soviet Union and the United States conflict that it was. Well, we all know generally what the Cold War is, but we remember this as the longest war without a shot fired, in which it was revolving around the ownership of nuclear weapons between these two nations. And we had events that I previously mentioned, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we came very close to living out this concept of mutually assured destruction. But thankfully, because of the rationality of individuals, and well, history books can tell you a million stories about that unique time that I have no capability of covering in just a 1-point slide, I do want to point out and make sure we remember the concept of mutually assured destruction through the example of the Cold War. No bombs were dropped, no lives were lost, because the concept of mutually assured destruction eventually brought us to peace before it brought us to fallout. So really quickly, let's dive into the Cold War. Remember 1945, 1993, Gorbachev's tear down that wall, a great time representing the decline of this conflict. We know that we also see SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. This was a treaty between the US and the Soviet Union to stabilize nuclear arms. As I previously mentioned, there were numerous treaties. We have treaties currently with Iran and other nations similar that limit the creation and the building up of their nuclear armaments. Now, when we look at the Cold War in contemporary impacts, of course, modern day, how has the Cold War impacted us since we did end this conflict in 1991? Well, it kind of represents the beginning of the great power competition. And it really, there's a mild crossover with the new contemporary threat of counterterrorism within the United States, of terrorism within the United States and our counterterrorism efforts. We see that even this is the point I like to tell. This is a detail you will not have to remember for an exam, but I like to tie in my second degree in Central Southwest Asian Studies real quick with a little bit of short storytelling. So we remember the Cold War was happening. It's the 90s, late 80s, and we're really starting to push back successfully against Soviet expansionism. And we see that there's a collective in Afghanistan that is in conflict with the Russian state, with the Soviet Union. And we see that, well, this collective They're known at the time as the Mujahideen. They're very successful in pushing back against these Russian troops. And if they were just funded and provided adequate military equipment, they would have a greater chance of really harming the abilities of the Soviet military. Sorry. My cat's going crazy for some reason right now. Hey, Mo, stop going crazy. So we saw this collective successfully pushing back at better rates than anybody would have anticipated at the time. So, led by a couple of representatives in the United States, we encouraged the funding of the Mujahideen. Now, the Mujahideen successfully pushed back and won their conflict in Afghanistan and combated Russian influence well. Remember, that was the whole basis of the Cold War. That's why we were in Vietnam in the 70s. We were thinking we need to help these small collectives not become Soviet satellite states. By that, I mean the Soviet Union was expanding. They were getting more and more states under their umbrella. We were pushing back. We had the 1950s period of McCarthyism, pushing back against communist sentiments, as we labeled the Russian state as the pure representation of communist ideology in its most negative form, and we had to push back against that. Well, just like we did in Vietnam, and we didn't deploy as many troops, but we mobilized our military, we funded the conflict, and we helped the Mujahideen push back successfully against Russian influence. Now, with acknowledgement, the Mujahideen, there is a lot of crossover with the leadership from the 90s to the early 2000s between the Mujahideen and the Taliban. So we do see the unintended impacts of engaging in international conflict that comes with that come, and one of them being the funding of a collective that later became an adversary of the United States, known quite well among most of us as the Taliban. If you're interested, in Arabic, Taliban means the collection of students. That's Talib is a student, and Taliban, collection of students. Fascinating just to understand it in a little bit more detail. If you were ever interested in political science and international conflict, I really encourage you to get into it because it's fascinating stuff. And understanding international conflict from the perspective of other nations is very fascinating to understand human nature, rationality, and really strategy between states as well. Now, what happened in response to the Cold War and the developments of the 1900s, the 20th century? We see the creation of the Great Power Competition. And this is a fight for hegemony between three leading nations globally, the US, Russia, and China. Now, what is hegemony? I'm probably saying it weird. People pronounce it funny. I pronounce it funny. Hegemony is the political, economic, and military predominance of one state over all others. Think about it's the United States' ability to exert influence on other nations or the international arena at large. A good example of this would be in defense of United States hegemony is when domestic economic policies go into effect, you can see ripple effects throughout the global economy. So we see that that is a detail that represents our hegemonic status on the international arena. So the Great Power Competition is what we're currently engaging with in international politics, when it's a simplified understanding. But we see that we're frequently fighting primarily through soft power and through economic engagement between these three nations. We see currently with Donald Trump's high tariffs on China, representation of this fight for hegemony between the two collectives. We see this conflict ongoing, but not occurring like we saw conflict occur during World War II or the Cold War. We're not in direct military threat of these nations, although we are in a constant challenge. We're all trying to win the championship of being the global leader and having hegemonic power. And the main takeaway from this slide, remember what hegemony is. Remember how to define that word. Now, quickly, counterterrorism. This is the current efforts we are maintaining. When you look at international foreign policy in our textbook, this is the main angle that our textbook identifies. Well, terrorism, it's important to define this. What is terrorism? Terrorism is the systemic attempt to incite fear to gain political ends. Terrorism is not one nation specific. Terrorism can be exerted from any nation in this globe as long as it's being done to incite fear to gain political ends. It can be done domestically. It can be done internationally. Um, the first time we heard the term used was during the French Revolution in the 1700s. Those French, they were very good at bringing up these new terms. Um, we also see some of the impacts of terrorism in the United States. Well, for one, of course, we understand we are engaged in the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq due to this conflict at large, due to past attempts to exert influence. We also see that we have certain things within the United States that we wouldn't have if it weren't for our counterterrorism efforts. Think about heightened airport security, the nationalization of airport security, not the social definition of nationalization, but the economic and industry-based definition of nationalization, which is the bringing together the private industries into public ownership by the government. Remember, they did that to make sure that airport security was consistent across the board and didn't allow for any gaps in security. We also see, due to this, heightened domestic surveillance, the Patriot Act in the early 2000s, and we also have seen, rationally so, a vast increase in military spending. So if it weren't for our current counterterrorism efforts, we probably would not be seeing such a long line at the airport security line. We probably wouldn't have had as many discussions in recent years about, you know, our phones and domestic surveillance. We also would probably see a smaller military spending budget. But these are all rational reactions our state has maintained in response to heightened terrorism at times, of course, both international and domestic. So, as we always have, what do we learn slides? You can review these. Since it's right here, I'd basically just be repeating myself. I'm not going to go over it, but make sure you go through and you double check that you understand the overpoints and what's expected of you on the final exam, because these questions will be asked on the final exam. And here are the answers to those questions. And what is due this week? Well, not this week, but coming up. You don't have another assignment other than these. Well, real quick, you do have a quick discussion post. Just the final discussion contribution. Just respond to a classmate, give them the follow up, and you're done. You're done with the discussion post. Congratulations. And then all you have to worry about in the next few days, I strongly suggest knocking that paper out, writing as much of it as you can, reaching out to me, scheduling a meeting if you need further clarification of your midterm comments, or if you need help in any way. I am more than happy to sit on a Zoom with every single one of you for multiple hours to just talk through how to write the best paper possible. I'd rather that than you struggle through it and spend an extra 5 hours. This is not necessarily a test on your abilities now. It's an opportunity for you to strengthen your writing abilities through this course. So please reach out. I am more than happy to help you and write this paper with you. So let me know if I can help in any way. And then we have our final exam around the corner. It's cumulative. It covers everything we've had on every quiz so far this year, in addition to another 15, 20 questions revolving around the last few lectures we've done. So please make sure you review the recent lectures and you review your past quizzes. That is the best way to study for your final exam. All right. Thank you guys. Reach out if there's anything I can do. I'm always here to help, and I always like hearing from you guys. So let me help you. Give me something to do. Thank you.